Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Chemistry of Colour workshop brought to you by the Great Exhibition Road Festival. Today, we're going to learn a bit about why some materials have colour, a bit about the history on how the first ever non-natural dye was made and its links to Imperial College, and also how to do some fun experiments with colour at home and then turn these into artwork. My name's Helena. I'm currently doing my PhD in chemical biology at Imperial College London. My research involves designing and creating new potential drugs for cancer immunotherapy, and I use various dyes to detect these in cells.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily and I'm currently doing my undergraduate master's degree in chemical engineering. This involves the study on how to operate and design chemical plants, but also how to improve industrial processes. You can't see her face right now, but another member of the team is Rosie. She's here with you in the live chat and she'll pass on all your questions and anything else you want to say to us. Also, if you want to join in the live chat, an adult needs to sign in using a Gmail address. We'd love to hear who you all are, so in the live chat, if you want to, please tell us your names and who the children and adults are so we know who's there. If you have any questions about the chemistry of colour, please write them in the same place and we hope to answer them by the end of this workshop. Please make sure you've got all that you need for our experiments today. We'll be demonstrating various short experiments and you're welcome to join in with as many as you want. So please make sure to download the instruction handout first, and there's a link for this in the description under the video. The handout includes details on all the materials you need and on how to use these. And don't worry if you don't have time to follow along with everything today, as the instruction sheets are there so that you can do things in your own time after the workshop as well. We'd love to see what you do and make today, so please take photos and share them with us as we go along using the Padlet link in the chat and in the description under the video. And remember to ask permission before using an adult's phone to do this.
So before we start with the experiments, we have a few slides to show you. So I will start, because I'm a scientist, to talking you through the science background of what colour is, why some chemicals have colour, and what this does. And then Emily will talk to you a bit from an engineering perspective of things that you have to think about when making something industrially. Cool. So the first thing to think about is, why do some molecules have a colour? So for molecules to have a colour, they need to meet these four sort of targets. So firstly, they need to absorb light between 400 and 700 nanometers. So light can have different wavelengths because it behaves like waves, and these wavelengths can have different amplitudes, which means they have sort of different frequencies. So this 400 to 700 nanometers means that they're waves of that specific size, because that range is where these waves express color. So the second thing that molecules have to have in order to express a color is they have to have something called a chromophore. The third thing is they have to have carbon-carbon double bonds, which I'll show you a bit later. And the fourth thing is they have to exhibit a phenomenon known as electron resonance. So here, I'm sure many of you will have seen a color wheel before, so I won't explain this in too much detail. I'm showing you this here so that you understand that color and light are very complex things, and that the color that we observe is dependent on where in the light spectrum the dye in the material is being excited. So as I've said in the previous slide, light can have various wavelengths, and the color that an object presents will depend on the wavelength of the light that excites this. The color that we see is due to the emission of the light that's absorbed. Excitation and emission are on opposite sides of the color wheel. For example, a color that is excited by a violet-red wavelength of light will appear yellow-green. So this slide is basically just a mathematical summary of what I've just said, but with a bit more detail. So it gives you the wavelength in nanometers, then the color that's absorbed, and the opposite color, so the color that's actually observed. This is quite a complex diagram to explain the processes that are happening to molecules in order for them to be excited by light and to emit a color. To give you an overview of this, what is responsible for molecule excitation is the movement of electrons. Here you can see various groups of lines. Each group represents an energy level. Electrons are able to move from one energy level to another, and it's this movement between energy levels that results in color. Moving up a level corresponds to the excitation. So if moving up is excitation, what process do you think will be the emission? So it's moving down a level, because what comes up has to then go back down. by doing this, by coming back down the energy level again, it gives out the energy that it has absorbed, which results in the colour being emitted. So now this guy here is William Perkin. He was a chemist who studied at what is now Imperial College London. He did this a very long time ago in the 1800s. When he was only 18, he discovered the first ever synthetic organic dye, which is movine, which is purple. He then went on to set up a factory to produce this dye industrially on a big scale. By doing this, he also had a big impact on the fashion industry. William Perkin was an early example of how you can be a scientist, but also an entrepreneur, and how science can have an impact in a range of fields. So this is the first piece of silk that William Perkin successfully dyed with the dye that he developed, movine. From a scientific and engineering perspective, it is one challenge to actually make the dye, and then a whole second set of challenges to figure out a way to use this dye and come up with a way to evenly disperse this on fabric. It was after developing and perfecting this process that he was then able to move on to industrial production. Here is the structure of movine dye, which Perkin developed. He made this by combining 3 different molecules, aniline and 2 forms of toluidine, known as ortho and para-toluidine. These 2 forms differ on the distance between the 2 different substituents present on the central ring. In the ortho form, hopefully you can see that these 2, what I call substituents, they're basically the 2 different sticks. They're basically right next to each other, whereas on the para form, they're opposite from each other. So the distance between these will change how these molecules behave. So they act like 2 different molecules, even though they're very similar. I've color-coded the different molecules so that you can hopefully see how they come together to form movine A, like a puzzle, essentially. In chemistry, a lot of making new things involves this, taking smaller molecules that already exist and combining them into making bigger molecules. So here on this slide are some natural dyes. So hopefully you can see that these are much more complex structures than movine A. So that's because naturally occurring dyes tend to be much more complicated, which is why it's useful for scientists and engineers to make synthetic dyes, because they're much simpler and they can be a lot smaller, which can affect their properties and applications. Although natural dyes can be very bright in color, they can be incredibly difficult to extract and isolate due to how complex they are. Their complexity can also make them quite unstable, and quite often they degrade when removed from their naturally occurring state. So I have now talked to you a bit about the science behind dyes, and hopefully you learned some new things. Please leave questions in the chat, which I can answer later if you have any questions on the chemistry. And Emily will now talk to you from an engineering perspective.
So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the industrial side of making dyes. One thing chemical engineers have to do is upscale small lab experiments like the ones you're doing at home onto a much larger scale for use in factories. Mixing is really important when making dyes, and so it's very important for us chemical engineers to study how mixing patterns might change on a larger scale. On the screen in a second is an example of a smaller scale mixer that Helen and I might use in the labs. The next picture is an example of the type of mixers we use on a much larger scale. For a little bit of perspective, some of these are very similar in size to a hot tub, and that's why you need stairs to reach them. One feature of mixing equipment that has a significant impact on mixing is what we call the impeller. This is the turbine that rotates and creates a flow pattern to mix the dyes. There are several factors that might affect the efficiency of mixing. For example, the shape, size, speed, number, height, and material of the impeller. Another important feature is the state of the reactants we want to mix. All of these different states, solid, liquid, or gas, all have different properties which affect the type of mixing equipment we will use. For example, in the case of lots of dyes, we will be working with liquids, but sometimes we might want to add solid particles, and this can complicate the mixing process, as we need to work out which conditions best spread the solid particles, but also how to dissolve them. The last state we might want to work with are gases. Each of these fluids have different properties which also affect mixing. For example, with liquids, we need to think about a property called viscosity, and this is essentially a measure of how easily a fluid is poured. For example, if we were to compare water to honey, Water has a very low viscosity because it's poured very easily, whilst honey is much thicker and stickier and harder to pour, and so it's got a larger viscosity. Now, here's an overview of the art projects that we'll be attempting today and that you'll be experts on, hopefully, after following along with today's workshop.
Oh, so before we start the art project demonstrating and the experiments, we've just had a question come in from LG, which is, how do they extract the dyes? Can some be harder to extract than others? Yes, you're absolutely right. It can be a lot more difficult to extract some dyes than others. And overall, it's a very complicated process that requires a lot of chemistry skill and usually quite a lot of people working together. So to give you an example, if, for example, you wanted to extract a natural dye that's present in a leaf, then you'd probably take the leaf, you'd have to mash it up with the sort of mixer that Emily showed earlier, and then you'd have to use separation techniques to separate the different molecules from within that leaf, and then select the one that has the dye. So as I'm sure you can imagine, there are so many different molecules present in a leaf. It can take a really long time to find the right one and to be able to separate it. So one of the ways that you can separate molecules is by size or by how polar they are, so how they react with different solvents, which takes a lot of troubleshooting, and you have to really know what you're looking for. And also, quite often, there's a lot of waste associated with trying to select for one tiny molecule out of hundreds of thousands. So quite often, this means that you have to take many, many leaves, maybe hundreds of leaves, just to get one tiny gram of dye. So that's why synthetic dyes can be a lot easier to use, because you don't have to do this extraction process, and you could control the amount you get a lot more. You don't have to use 1,000 grams to then get 1 gram. So hopefully that answers your question. I see we've got another question from Local, which is, are clothing dyes complex? So it depends on the kind of dye, but that is a very good question. So hopefully you saw that Movine A, which we showed the dye structure, so it was simpler than some of the natural dyes. So the natural dyes that I showed you were chlorophyll, which is in plants, and then a dye that's present in beetles. So then we have a third question, which is for Emily. So Emily, do you want to answer this question from Bianca?
Yeah. So essentially, viscosity is dependent on the type of molecule used. And as Helena had explained earlier, the type of color that's emitted or produced from a certain molecule is also dependent on the molecule structure. However, the color and the viscosity aren't directly related. So you could have something that's pink, and it might be very easy to pour, and another pink molecule that would be a lot thicker and harder to pour. So for example, honey and oil, they're both orange in color. However, oil is a lot more easier to pour, whereas honey is a lot harder to pour. So honey has a larger viscosity than oil does. So I hope that's answered your question, Bianca.
I think we'll move on now to demonstrating the first activity, which will be done by Emily.
Yeah, so the first practical we'll be doing is making pictures out of fruity crayons and fruity inks. So I hope you've got all of the materials you need, which is explained on the instruction sheet. So if you've got your fresh berries like blackberries, strawberries or raspberries, your cups, plates or bowls, cotton wool, brushes, cutlery, and any paper that you have available, and also some water on hand. So for the fruity crayons, if you take a whole piece of your blackberry, raspberry, or strawberry and use it like a crayon, you can make marks or create shapes and color in drawings using the fruit with your fingers. So for example, if I was to use a raspberry, which I have here, you can take the raspberry, and for example, what I'm going to do, I'm going to dab it in different places and hopefully be able to make a flower. And remember, guys, as you do this, please send some of the photos of the artwork that you're creating into the Padlet so we can show them to the rest of the group today. For blueberries, it will be slightly harder because they're not as juicy as the raspberries, but we'll have a go. Okay, and now I'm going to demonstrate how you can make pastes and fruity inks out of these same fruits. So if you have a bowl available, you can take some of the, for example, raspberries that I've got. Mash them up a little bit with any utensils you have. Like so. And then use any of your either paint brushes, or what I've got here are some Q-tips, which are quite good. And you can use them as like a paintbrush to paint your pictures. So I'm going to try and draw a butterfly. So what kind of pictures are you guys drawing today? Flowers, butterflies like I am doing, or rainbows if you've got a wider selection of fruits? But it'd be great to see some of them if you upload it into the Padlet. Okay, so now I'm going to try do the same, but with the blueberries. In the same way, just mash them up. You don't need to be careful about this. You can also use different things. So I'm going to use some cotton pads because they take up the colour really well. It will also create different textures once you dab them onto the piece of paper. Another thing you could do is take your cotton wool pad and you can draw pictures on the cotton wool pad because the type of fibers that the cotton wool has absorbs lots of the color better. So as I'm going to show you now, you'll see the colors come across a lot more vibrant. Another thing you can do with this is take some of the juice that's come out of the raspberries or any of the fruits that you've got, if you've got some blackberries too, and sometimes that works better without the clumps. So as you can see, it comes across a lot brighter. Oh, so Fatima's said that they're making a flower. Does anyone else have anything to say about what they're making?
While Emily's demonstrating some painting, and while hopefully you're following along, I can see that there's a few questions that have come through for me, so I thought I could quickly answer them. So there's a question from Otti, which is, can you have a dye from insect beetles? So yes, in fact, you can. There's a compound that can be extracted from beetles, which is called carminic acid, which is then turned into carmine, which is used in quite a lot of cosmetics, such as lipsticks, because it's bright red. So maybe you've heard that some cosmetics brands sometimes advertise their products and they say this is vegan. So by that, they mean that it doesn't have carminic acid in it, because quite often red cosmetics and red pigments do use molecules from beetles. So then I'm trying to see. I think there's another question on can we use this dye to dye a fabric? This question's from SV. And would it last in fabric? So by this, I'm guessing you mean dyes from fruits. So yes, you probably could. However, these dyes are very dilute because there's a lot of water in these fruits. So you'd probably have to do some of the extracting that I mentioned earlier. So you'd have to extract only the dye molecule so that this is much more concentrated, so that then the dye would stick. You're welcome to have a go if you have an old t-shirt or something and you want to try and dye it. My guess is that because this dye is very soluble in water, that even if you do stain it a bit, it will only be a tiny bit and then it will wash off. So you'd probably need to do some industrial scaling up, like Emily mentioned. Emily, there's a question for you from Devon. I'll read it out for you if you want, since I know you're busy. So it's, how do you ensure that the solution is homogeneously mixed? What type of instruments do you use for that? And do you have any specific tricks that you've tried?
Okay, so hi Devon, that's a really good question. So one of my experiments that I've recently done in my undergraduate degree was determining how well a mixture was homogeneously mixed. And the way that we chose to do it was by using a camera. So we filmed our experimental setup, and what we did was we had our impeller and we used black ink, only a small amount, which we inserted into the top of the mixer. And then we filmed using the camera the whole process until it was all mixed. And then what we later did was use a computer software, which we coded to measure when the picture that was captured from the camera was homogeneous, so all the same shade, and there was no discrepancies or anything. And at that point, we stopped the timer, and that's how we measured the time it took for the mixture to be homogeneously mixed. We chose this method because it was easy to do in a lab, and it was reasonably reliable. But there's lots of different methods you can use. You can use spectroscopy, you can use an electron telescope. But lots of these you have to consider how you'd translate it onto a larger scale. So, for example, with anything that's to do with light. So, if you were to shine light through the mixture and measure how that light is received from the mixture, and to tell if that's homogeneously mixed, that wouldn't be easy to translate on a larger scale, because in most industrial processes the mixing vessel isn't clear. So whereas now, for example, I've got a clear glass, in the labs you often use clear glass. So the method that we used with the ink, we wouldn't be able to do on a larger scale because the vessel wouldn't be clear, it would be metal. So different things like an electroscope would be better. But that's a great question. It's something that lots of chemical engineers spend a lot of time on perfecting. But yeah, great question, Devon. So as you can see, I've made a little artwork on this cotton pad. But another thing that you could do is directly absorb some of the juice from the fruit. And this will become really bright in a second if I show you. So guys, remember to take pictures of your artwork and upload them to the Padlet so we can show everyone your hard work. So can you see how bright this is? It's almost the same color as the raspberries themselves, whereas on this paper, it hasn't taken up the color as well. But you can do lots of different things in experiments. So I don't know, I was thinking, oh, what would it be like if I used this to print and transfer the color onto this? Would it change the texture? So let's try. So I hope you guys can see that, but it's a lot paler than the cotton wool pad. Okay, so now we're going to go and move on. I think Helena has a question for you guys.
Yes. So my question for you is, so William Perkin, as we discussed earlier, made Movine, which is a purple dye. Personally, I love purple. It's my favorite color. So I really enjoyed incorporating purple dyes into this workshop. So we'd love for you to tell us what's your favorite color, and can you think of a natural material such as a fruit or a vegetable where you could extract this color from? So now we're going to move on to the next activity, and I will demonstrate some painting with Skittles for you. So hopefully you can see my plate okay. So for this, you'll need a plate, some Skittles, some cotton wool, and either a second plate or some tissue to then put things to dry. So here I have sour Skittles because they have brighter colours, but you can have a go with various types of Skittles. Different types of Skittles have different colours, so you can see if using different colours gives you different results. There's a lot of experimenting you can do at home. So the first thing that you want to do is display the Skittles on the plate, like I'm doing here. So you can use any combination of colours you want. You can arrange them in any way you want. I mean, really, you can have a lot of fun with this. You can see if different arrangements or different combinations of colors then give you different patterns at the end. So now I've got quite a lot of Skittles here. I'm arranging them really close together in the center because I want the colors to kind of really spiral and be sort of really merge into each other. So once you have them arranged, you then just pour a bit of water so that it covers the bottom of the plate and so that you go about halfway up the Skittle. So hopefully you can see now that I've done that. And then we're just going to wait a minute or so for the dyes in the Skittle to run off into the water. So this is a process called diffusion. So I can already see it happening. You might be able to see in the video that it's happening. I will also lift my camera up and give you a close-up once it's fully happened. So I'd love to know, is anyone following along with this at the moment? Does anyone have any ideas on maybe a different type of sweet that you could try and do this with? Hopefully you can see that the color here is coming out and it's forming some really pretty patterns. So another question I have for you is, why do you think that we're doing the water halfway up the Skittles? So there's several reasons for that. So the first reason is, if we covered the Skittles in water, the dyes would come out so dilute that then you wouldn't be able to see them very well. And the second reason is then you can flip the Skittles over and do it twice. So in fact, I'm going to do that now. So I already have some nice bright colors, but if I flip all the Skittles over, I will then have even brighter colors. So that's one of my tips and tricks for you. Oh, great. I see that the Moss family are suggesting Smarties and someone else is suggesting jelly beans. Yeah, these are both great ideas. So with Smarties, the issue you might find is that the chocolate starts to melt, which then you might end up with some brown messiness, but it's worth a try. I've never tried it. So now I think the dye has come out of the Skittles. So I'm going to show you a different angle so that you can hopefully see from the top. Oh, my camera seems to have slowed down a bit. So I'll show you from my main camera because my side camera seems to slow down a bit, but hopefully you can see that. So now, hopefully you can see there's a lot of color here. So we don't need the Skittles anymore. They're now white, mostly white. They've changed a lot in color because the color has come off. So I'm just going to take the Skittles off. So for this, you can either use a second plate or some tissue, as I'm doing now, just something to put them on. And then you can put something into the plate to transfer the color on. So as Emily said earlier, cotton pads work really well. So I'm going to use a cotton pad now. So hopefully you can see that that's transferred lots of really pretty colors and it's really purpley at the moment. So I'm going to use another tissue, or you can use a plate, whatever you want, to put it on to dry for a bit. So these are very wet, so it will most likely take a few hours to dry. If you have an adult helping you, you can use a hairdryer to dry them, or you can just leave them in the sun overnight. Luckily, the weather's really nice today, so hopefully it will dry within a few hours. So can you see that as I dip more cotton wool in, the color is disappearing from the plate because I'm picking more of it up? So I think now this is probably as much as I'm going to get. The plate is almost colorless again now. And hopefully you can see that I have my 4 cotton wool pads, all of different colors. They look even prettier in person than on camera. And then later we'll use them in some art projects. So that's everything for my Skittles painting activity. Next, Emily will talk a bit about marbling.
Okay, so with marbling, this is a bit of a long experiment. So what we suggest is that you try this out later. I'll show you some that we've done earlier, but if you follow the instruction sheet, there it's pretty easy to follow, and you can create really nice pictures out of it. What we suggest doing as well is you create these patterns, but then you can also try and make other things, such as bunting, which we'll show you later. So as you can see here, this is an example of some of the bunting that we made using the ink patterns. This is just something fun that you could do. There's lots of other things that you could make. Do you guys have any suggestions of what we could use some of the artwork we made today to make? And this is great for summer now. It's really nice weather. So if you're planning to have a little party with your friends in the park, then you could make some of this bunting and decorate it and then show off to all of your friends. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to demonstrate spice painting. Okay. So as you can see here, I've got 2 bowls, one of turmeric and one of paprika. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of water and add it to your bowls. And you can either take a spoon or another Q-tip or any utensil you have and give it a bit of a mix. And guys, remember, it would be great to see some of your Skittle artwork that you created. So if you pop that onto the Padlet, we can take a look and show everyone what you've done. Now for the turmeric. And depending on how much water you add, the thicker or the more watery your paste will be. And that will also affect how concentrated the paint you create is. Okay, so since we're using yellow, I might try and draw a sunflower. So what do you guys think would be a good thing to make out of these spices? Just let us know in the chat, and that would be great. Okay, so I'm using this darker brown for the middle. And then for the petals, I'm going to use the turmeric. Oh, so we've got a comment from Mark, and that you're using turmeric and paprika to paint as well, and that it smells great. Just remember, don't eat it. You can't eat paper. But that comes up with another idea. Like if you had some plain biscuits or crackers, you could always try and paint some of those and make edible treats. Edible pieces of artwork. But remember, depending on the spice that you use, you should be really careful because you don't want to be using chili and then burn your mouth. But also as well, these spices are going to be quite concentrated, so it might be bitter too. So just keep those things in mind. But then what else could you use in your house? What could you find in your house that would be maybe sweeter or not as strong, but also transfer the colors well, so that you could create your edible treats, your edible artworks. Okay, this is my sunflower, but it looks a little bit closer to a sun. I'm not the best artist in the world, but anyone can make these. So another thing that you could do, but make sure to check with your parents first because it's quite messy. But you can take a paintbrush, for example, and flick, and this creates a different pattern, similar to the oil paintings that you can do later that we just talked about. And another thing to note with this, we're using turmeric, which is it stains very easily. So really make sure to double check with your parents this is okay. Or if you've got some aprons on, just to make sure you don't stain your clothes. What other techniques do you think you could use to create different patterns? Now I'm going to demonstrate with some of the cotton wool pads to see how well it absorbs the colour. So this is the turmeric. Wow, look how bright that is compared to our drawing. Okay, now for the paprika. Can you guys see that? And that's also interesting to note. So ordinarily, when you look at paprika in solid form, it comes across more red. But once we've added the liquid, it becomes more of a brown color. So that's something that you need to consider when making dyes, is that the solid form and the liquid form may appear in different colors. It's like if you were to do baking and you use some food coloring, the food coloring is always a lot darker and concentrated than the icing, for example, that you might make out of it. So for example, green food coloring comes across almost as black when it's in its jar, but once you've diluted it and added it to your icing, for example, then it becomes green. and the same for yellow and red. Okay, so now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Momtaz, who was the artist that we were very lucky to collaborate with. She's a professional artist, and she came up with all of these simple and fun art projects that incorporated the experiments that we've done today. And so working with an artist really inspired us to be more creative and to think of our science in a different way. So have any of the activities that you've seen today inspired you to think of any other types of artwork that you could make? And if you do, it'd be great if you could let us know what those ideas are and add them to the chat. And remember, guys, to put all of your artwork onto the Padlet so we can show everyone at the end. So what we're going to do now is just show you some of the things that you could make out of the artwork that we've done today. So while we're waiting for these to dry, we can show you some of the stuff that we done earlier. As I showed you before, this is the oil artwork that we created bunting with. And this is also something that you should be careful with when you're doing with your parents, because oil does stain clothes and you don't want to ruin your best. Okay. So this is an example of something that you could create with the spices that we made. You can see it on the screen and on the camera. But depending on the spices that you use, you can create different images. The one that you see on the screen right now, we've used the turmeric as the background, and then used a different technique of the splatting with the paintbrush that I was talking about to create the sand. And then for the sun, they've actually used black currants. So they've combined both methods using the spice and the fruit to create this collage. So what kind of pictures do you think you guys could make? What collages would you do? And what fruits and what spices would you use to make them? I think Helena also has a flower card that you could potentially make.
Yes, so here's a type of flower card that you can make. I think it looks really cool. So these bits here, they stick out because they're from the Skittles printing, once it's dry, of course. And then this is from the marbling that Emily showed you. I also have some pieces of marbled paper here from what they look like. So you can see they're super vibrant and they look really cool. So this is because out of all the activities that we've shown you today, this marbling is the only one that uses synthetic dyes because it uses food coloring. So that comes back to what we were discussing earlier of natural versus synthetic dyes, the differences between them, how they're made, how bright they are, how concentrated they are. So yeah, we would love for you to have a go at making something like this once everything you've done today is dry. And can you think of any other activities that you could do to maybe utilize the Skittles printing? So there's loads you can do. You can cut them out in to different shapes. You could also, instead of cotton wool, you could try paper, see how that works, or just yeah, we'd love to hear if you have any other suggestions for types of things you can do. You can also, of course, combine the spice painting with these. So, for example, you could have a white card and then paint the whole card orange or red with the spice first, and then stick on the Skittles. Or you could use the fruity paints to make these circles instead of the marbling. So what we're aiming to do today is to show you, give you lots of different tools for things that you can use and then combine into art projects where you essentially make collages with things made in lots of different ways. So now we'd love to answer some more questions. So if anyone has any questions, please do leave them in the chat. Oh, I see that someone, Goldfire Narration, has said, is that a tea bag? So we didn't use tea bags today, but that's a good point. You could also do a lot of painting with tea bags. We didn't use tea bags today because we thought lots of you would have probably already done it, and we wanted to try and show you activities that maybe you hadn't done before, but you could absolutely add some tea bag painting into this. So does anyone have any suggestions, any ideas on things they could do to incorporate tea bags into this? Oh, then there's a question from Sonali. Any idea on how we could dye Skittles on fabric? Oh, that's a very good idea. So you'd probably need quite a lot of Skittles. So hopefully if you remember what I was saying earlier, how sometimes when you want to extract dyes, they're quite dilute. I guess I see another question. Do we need to concentrate it too, or will dilute work? I think if you just put loads and loads of Skittles on a plate and then a tiny amount of water, it might work. Or you could also try marbling it as well. Because marbling with the oil, as Emily said, oil does stain fabric and it doesn't wash off. So that could be something that you could try. You could try both. Try it first with just water and see if it washes out, which I think it probably will, and then try and incorporate it with oil and see then if it stays more. But if you think about it, Skittles, the dyes in Skittles, they're safe to eat. So anything that's safe to eat usually does dissolve in water. So when you wash it, it might dissolve.
That's another activity you could do. So if you didn't want, if you wanted to take a step up from these edible dyes, which Helena just said could wash out, if you wanted to create a t-shirt or something that you could have permanently and wear and show off all of your hard work, synthetic dyes and tie-dyeing is a great way to experiment with these colors. So maybe if your parents have time, you can suggest or ask them if that's an activity that you could do. But that's really fun. But remember again that they are synthetic dyes and they will stain. But you can create really fantastic images and artwork with those.
There's a question from the Moss family on what is the most complicated dye. That's a very good question. So it depends by what you mean most complicated. If you mean by structure, then there's a lot of research going on at the moment on trying to make dyes using metal elements. So these are very, very complicated structures. Usually people will try and take a natural dye. So hopefully if you remember from one of the slides I showed earlier, one of the really, really complicated structures. So they'll try and take one of them and then make it brighter by adding a metal element right in the middle of the dye. So I would say they're very, very complicated. Oh, we also have a comment from Mark, which is make an old looking map with a tea bag. Yeah, that's a really good idea. So do you have any ideas on how you could do that and make it into a card? So maybe if you wanted to do kind of a treasure hunt for someone or even an Easter egg hunt, you could make a card and make the card have a map inside it. And then maybe you could use the Skittles painting to kind of stick things onto the card. So maybe kind of stick a cross on where the eggs are hidden and things like that.
Oh, I've also seen that Layla was making a garden earlier, so that's really good. So if you've got the more selection of fruits that you've got and spices, you can create a larger garden. And that's something that you could do with friends as well. Like if you all created some flowers, you can all add it into one massive forest or rainforest or garden, whatever you want to choose.
And Alison's asking, how about using spinach to get a green color? Yes, that's a very good idea. You can definitely do that. And the color in spinach is quite bright. Just remember not to use as little water as you can. The less water you do, the brighter the color will be, and also the less time it will take to dry. So, Emily, did you say that it was Layla who was making a garden? So
yeah, Layla made a garden.
Yeah, Layla, are you using any greens? I'd be really interested to know if you are using greens and what you're using for that. And maybe you would have some tips for Alison on using spinach or getting green colors.
Another thing that's quite interesting as well, that you can do over time, we won't show it today because it does take a couple of days, but celery or using white roses and soaking them in a solution of synthetic dye. So if you have any food coloring, add some of that to water and let the celery or flour sit in it for a couple of days, and you'll see gradually how the plants uptake the water and eventually change color from the dyes. But that's something that you could do in your spare time. Remember to ask your parents if that's all right.
Oh, we've got a really good question on how did you know you wanted to be a scientist? So for me, I always really liked science in school. And when I was really young, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor because that's what I thought if you were good at science, you went on to be a doctor. But then I did some work experience in hospitals and I realized that being a doctor wasn't for me because I found the whole aspect of dealing with patients and the emotional side really difficult. But then I thought, I still want to help people. Is there anything I can do to help people and help cure diseases without being a medical doctor? And then I did some research and I realized that I could study chemistry and then make new drugs and help develop treatments that then doctors can use. So I then went off to university. I did a degree in chemistry. I did an undergraduate master's degree in chemistry. Then I went on to do a second master's degree in chemical biology, where I was using chemistry for medical and biology applications. And my first master's project was making treatments for tuberculosis, and my second one was cancer. And now I enjoyed that so much that now I'm doing research full time and working towards a PhD in cancer. So, Emily, would you like to share how did you know that you wanted to be a scientist?
Okay, so when I was at school, I always enjoyed all of the sciences, so physics, chemistry, maths, biology, and I didn't really want to pick a specific one. And so that's why I took a branch from science, which is engineering. And engineering combines all of these sciences together with maths in a problem solving setting. And that's something that I really enjoy, solving problems, but also working out how to translate things from the smaller scale, as I said before, on the lab scale, all the way up to a larger scale, and using science to solve the world's biggest problems and find solutions to these. But that's what really drove my passion towards engineering and science. But also, if you guys are really interested in STEM, there's lots of different resources out there and competitions that you can get into. One of them is the Big Bang Fair, which Helena and I are very familiar with, and we participated in. And they have activities for those both under 11 and over 11, which would be great. So the parents here today, if you wanted to find any other resources, the Big Bang is a really great option. And yeah, kids, it's a great way to really explore what's out there, and find out which area of STEM that you really enjoy. So as Helena said, she knew she didn't like medicine, but that's only because she tried it out. So really make sure you try everything and all the different routes available before you decide on what you enjoy, and then you can really focus all of your attention and passion towards that. Oh, I've seen that Layla had used the cumin for the soil in her garden. So that's a really great idea. And strawberry, yeah, to use as a brush. But also, someone asked about oranges. So this is some color that we made earlier from a tangerine. So that's another option you could use. And we can compare this to the turmeric. So it depends what you want. If you want a more pale color, you can stick with the tangerine. And remember that the tangerine is probably a lot nicer. If you wanted to make some edible artwork, the tangerine would be a better choice because the turmeric is quite bitter.
Oh, we have quite a lot of photos coming up on the Padlet, which is very exciting. So we're going to show you some of them now. Please do keep submitting photos as well. We know that lots of this artwork needs time to dry, so you can submit photos later today or tomorrow or just anytime you want. But it's really lovely to see some of the artwork that you're all doing. Everything looks really great, and there's a lot of really nice ideas there and a lot of really nice colours.
Oh, we've seen that Samuel Kelly has made a farm cat with 3 legs.
That's a very nice looking cat. I love how the whiskers are a different colour to the body as well. And I really love, I think it's Logan, who has used turmeric, chili powder and raspberries. So Logan has combined several of the techniques that we show today. Also, someone has uploaded some amazing artwork with sunflowers and hearts, and I think it's a person as well. They're all really great. Oh, there's some Skittles painting going on as well.
Wow, yeah, the colours. You've got a really good range in the way you've arranged it as well. It's
Yeah,
in a rainbow too, so that's really
yeah. It'll
interesting.
be really nice to see what the cotton pads come out like if you end up using them. Oh, there's some more questions as well. There's a question from the Moss family. What is the most simple dye? I'll have to have a think about that, and I'll get back to you in a minute or two, because that's a very good question. But yeah, I'll come back to you on that. And oh, there's a question from LG. Can you use beetroot? So Emily, what do you think about
So
using
beetroot, I think, is a great option because I don't know if you have used it in salads, but even when you're touching with your fingers will stain a purple color. But if you wanted to get a really strong color, you could use beetroot or also red cabbage. But for this, the best option would be to boil it over a couple of hours and leave it overnight to create a really saturated solution. But that would be a great option for some artwork if you wanted to try that. Great idea, LG.
Oh, I have an answer for the Moss family. What's the most simplest dye? So in my opinion, one of the simplest ones is indigo dye, which is used in jeans. So it's quite cheap to make. It's quite easy to make quite a lot of it and to purify it. So that's why denim, kind of the dye in denim and jeans are kind of made so much, why so many different brands make them and why so much is made with jeans, because it's quite an easy dye to use. So if you have a think about it, the kind of dyes, the colors that are most unusual and the fabrics that are most unusual in clothes and most expensive, it tends to be because they're more difficult to make. But the ones that are more readily available tend to be easier. And that can either be because they're cheaper to make, or they're easier to extract if they're natural dyes, or that they're just simpler structures, or maybe all three of those things. Okay, well, we're coming up to 12 o'clock now. So we hope you've enjoyed the workshop today. And please do tell us in the chat what your favorite activity that we did today was. And if you learned anything new, and if you have any suggestions on other activities that we could add. So I know people have already been discussing the tea bags, which is a really great suggestion. So does anyone have any other suggestions? So thank you to everyone for joining and for your many inspiring questions and comments. We're very much looking forward to seeing everyone's pictures, so please do keep creating and sharing them with us via the Padlet. We're also posting a link in the chat to a quick survey where you can tell us what you thought of the event, and we'd love it if you could take 5 minutes to tell us. Please keep an eye out for future family workshops from the Great Exhibition Road Festival. The next event is about very, very small things. And thank you for joining us. And from both of us, goodbye and have a good day, everyone.